Hi everyone, my name is Laura and I'll be going over the impact of diet culture on disordered eating behaviors in college students. A quick outline, we'll go over the introduction of disordered eating and eating disorders, college students and their eating disorders, diet culture, and how to assess the risk of disordered eating. Then we'll jump into the research study going over my purpose, methods, stats, results, discussion, and conclusion. So disordered eating is a wide range of irregular eating behaviors that do not warrant a diagnosis of a specific eating disorder. These behaviors can include unhealthy body or food behaviors such as dieting, skipping meals, supplement misuse, and heightened focus on body appearance. You'll find that there is a spectrum of eating behaviors ranging from healthy eating all the way to a full-blown eating disorder, and disordered eating falls in the middle. Now, eating disorders are defined as a disturbance of eating-related behavior that results in the altered consumption or absorption of food and that significantly impairs physical health or psychosocial functioning. One study found that eating disorder prevalence increased over the study period from 3.5% for the 2000 to 2006 period to 7.8% for the 2013 to 2018 period. Types of eating disorders that are diagnosable include binge eating disorder, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, pica, and other specified feeding or eating disorders. Disordered eating in college students. Traditionally, undergraduate years directly coincide with the median age of onset for eating disorders. College students are at an increased risk, with 11.9% having a global EDEQ score over 3, 40.2% reporting objective binge eating behaviors, 30.2% reporting compensatory behaviors, and they found that the prevalence of eating disorder risk increased from 14.9% in 2013 to 28% in 2020/2021. Diet culture is a term that many are familiar with, but you might not know. In our research, it's defined as the worship of thinness as a signifier of status and moral virtue, the castigation of those whose body fails to comply, and the demonization of certain food choices in comparison to others. In more simple terms, diet culture means that skinny equals healthy, superior, or moral, and fat means that unhealthy, inferior, or immoral. Diet culture often encourages restricted eating, dieting, weight loss, or unpleasant or compulsive movement. To assess the risk for eating disorders, we utilize the EAT26 test. This is the Eating Attitudes Test. It's a standardized self-reporting measure of symptoms and concerns characteristic of eating disorders. For scoring, the first 26 questions are a Likert scale. So if a participant scores over 20, they are provided an immediate referral to an eating disorder professional. Then that's followed by a couple behavioral questions. If any of the answers to these questions are yes, they also receive a referral. We used the EAT26 test because it was low cost, easily accessible, and ideal for school settings. Jumping into our research, the purpose of this study was to identify the portion of college students that met the EAT26 qualifications for referral, and to investigate college students' relationship with food, knowledge and exposure to diet culture, and perceived influence of diet culture on eating behaviors. The methods: we had participants that were 18 years of age or older that must have been enrolled in a minimum of one college-level course. For recruitment, I created a virtual flyer that was posted on Instagram and Facebook, and I also contacted professors from various schools and departments across the country. This is a cross-sectional survey. Our survey had 43 questions. The start was self-reported demographic data, including college enrollment, age, gender identity, ethnicity, class standing, and area of study. We also asked questions on food relationship, diet culture knowledge, exposure, and influence. This was followed by the EAT26 questionnaire. This was an anonymous survey, so no personal information on the participants was collected. All of our data was analyzed using SPSS. We had descriptive statistics that were calculated to summarize demographic characteristics of the sample, categorical data that was presented via frequencies and percentages, and we ran chi-squared tests to assess the association between categorical variables. For our results, the average age range was 18 to 29. The majority of our participants identified as women, and a large percentage were white. Now for our results in relationship with food, 60 participants reported a poor relationship with food, 40 participants reported a neutral relationship, 72 reported a good relationship, 19 reported a very good relationship, and 8 were unsure of their relationship. We found that there was a strong relationship between the need for referral and a participant's relationship with food, with those reporting a poorer relationship with food being more likely to qualify for a referral. We also found a significant relationship between the familiarity with diet culture and a person's relationship with food, with those reporting a poor relationship with food being more likely to report familiarity with diet culture. Finally, we found a significant relationship between relationship with food and gender identity, with those identifying as women and gender queer being more likely to report a poor relationship with food. You can see here we have our frequencies. We found no relationship between a health versus non-health major. Gender identity, female and genderqueer people are up in the poor or neutral range, and men identifying people were closer to good and very good. You also see that as familiarity with diet culture increased, the relationship with food was in the poor or neutral section, and those that were less familiar were in the good or very good section. Other results in terms of familiarity with diet culture: 106 participants reported being very familiar with the term, 31 participants were quite familiar, 25 participants were moderately familiar, 24 participants were slightly familiar, and 11 participants were not familiar at all. 2 participants were unsure of their familiarity. In total, 93.6 exhibited some level of knowledge of the term diet culture. We also found a strong relationship between our participants' gender and their familiarity with diet culture, with those identifying as women and genderqueer being more likely to report familiarity with diet culture. In terms of familiarity with diet culture and reported influence of diet culture on eating behaviors, those that reported a higher level of familiarity with diet culture were more likely to report higher influence of diet culture on eating behaviors. Finally, there was a significance found between familiarity with diet culture and our relationship with food, with those reporting a higher level of familiarity being more likely to report a low relationship with food. Again, you'll see our frequencies here. There is no relationship between the health versus non-health majors and familiarity with diet culture, and women and genderqueer people are clumped towards the very familiar or quite familiar, and men identifying people are closer to the slightly familiar or moderately familiar. For age and environment of exposure, 98 participants reported being exposed less than 10 years old. 78 participants were 10 to 19 at age of initial exposure. 3 participants were 20 to 29. 11 participants were unsure of their initial exposure, and 9 participants reported never being exposed. We found a relationship between age of exposure and gender identity, with women and genderqueer people being more likely to report lower age of exposure. We also found a significant correlation between age of exposure and level of influence on diet culture on eating behaviors, with those reporting a lower age of exposure being more likely to report higher levels of influence. So here you'll see the frequencies for our data, and you'll see that women and genderqueer people are more likely to be clumped in the less than 10 age range, whereas men are more likely to be in the 10 to 19. This is where the bulk of our results are, which is the influence of diet culture on eating behavior. 25 participants reported that diet culture always influences eating behaviors. 27 participants reported it usually does. 60 participants reported it often does. 25 participants reported it rarely does. 8 participants reported it never does, and 4 participants were unsure. We found a strong relationship between gender identity and belief that believed influence of diet culture on eating behaviors, with women and genderqueer people having a higher likelihood of more influence. We also found a relationship between believed influence on eating behaviors and relationship with food, with those reporting a poor relationship with food being more likely to have a higher belief of influence. We found that familiarity with diet culture and believed influence on eating behaviors had a relationship, with those reporting a higher level of familiarity being more likely to believe increased influence. Finally, we found a relationship between age of exposure and the influence of diet culture on eating behaviors, with those reporting a lower age of exposure being more likely to report higher influence. And you'll see our frequencies here, along with no relationship between the health and non-health majors, and you'll see that female and genderqueer people are more clumped towards the always, usually, and often, whereas male people are more towards sometimes, rarely, or never. And then some more results, you'll see that as relationship with food is poorer, there's also a higher level of influence. And age of initial exposure to diet culture, those that are less than 10, you'll see it's clumped towards always, usually, and often, versus as the ages get higher, it's closer to sometimes and rarely. And then familiarity with diet culture, those that are reporting no familiarity at all or slight familiarity are more clumped towards rarely or never for the influence, and those that are very familiar are clumped towards always and usually. Going into the referral results, 97 participants met the EAT-26 qualifications for referral. Of those needing referral, 76 self-identified as women, 12 self-identified as men, and 8 self-identified as part of the genderqueer community. We found a relationship between referral and a person's relationship with food, with those reporting a poor relationship with food being more likely to qualify for a referral. We also found a relationship between referral and belief that diet culture influences eating behaviors, with those reporting a higher level of influence being more likely to qualify for a referral. And here you'll see some of the same. We have our frequencies for referrals here. No relationship between health versus non-health majors. For gender identity, you'll see no relationship in terms of referrals. Same with age range, but when we get to relationship with food and meeting threshold for referral, those with a poor relationship are more likely to meet the referral versus a good relationship or very good relationship. And continuing on to diet culture influencing eating, it's the same, that those reporting always, usually, or often are more likely to meet the thresholds compared to sometimes, rarely, or never. Going into our discussion, the primary findings of this research is that 81.5% of respondents report that diet culture influences their eating behaviors in some way. As participants reported feeling a stronger influence from diet culture, they were increasingly likely to meet the EAT-26 criteria for referral to an eating disorder professional. Our secondary findings were the earlier a person recalls being exposed to diet culture, the more likely they are to meet the threshold for referral. We also found that exposure to diet culture at a young age may lead to increased belief that diet culture influences their eating behaviors as adults. There are some strengths and limitations of this study. One limitation was that our sample size was 199. This was an adequate sample size for our study, but it may not be representative of all student bodies. There is also the potential for response and recall bias in our survey. Some of the strengths were that we had an anonymous survey. This put less pressure on participants to answer in a specific kind of way and reduced the amount of stigma they were facing. And this was one of the first studies of its kind. So in conclusion, this study provides significant evidence that diet culture negatively impacts college students' eating behaviors. Diet culture influence leads to increased EAT-26 scores in college students. Women and genderqueer students are especially susceptible to developing disordered eating as a result of the influence of diet culture, and students need additional levels of support during their studies via prevention programs, including media literacy, anti-diet nutrition support, coping skills, and access to mental health support. Thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And these are my references.